while the war was happening in Europe and in the Pacific, what we're going to focus on here is kind of what was happening in the United States and how people were coming together to support the war efforts. As we start to talk about American mobilization, we're going to look at this quote from FDR. It goes like this: "We look forward to a world founded upon four essential freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way. The third is freedom from want or need. And the fourth is freedom from fear." Obviously, we've looked a little bit at FDR, his idea of bringing hope to the people. But really what he's looking at here is how and why is it important that the United States be involved in the war? You can see this is from January of 1941. We don't join the war until December of 1941. But what he's saying in this quote is the idea that we protect these rights for Americans, right? These are for rights that are protected, but that they shouldn't just be protected for Americans, but instead they should be protected for people all around the world. When we're talking about mobilization, what we're really talking about is preparing for war, whether that be, mobilizing troops, so moving your troops or making sure that you have enough weapons produced for war. That's the idea of mobilization. And so we can look and see how we mobilized throughout the war and even before the war started, or at least our involvement in the war. So we talked about the Lend-Lease Act that was passed right early on to try to help out our allies in Europe. But here's some other examples. You have the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. So again, by 1940, the war was happening in Europe. We, however, had not joined the war at this point. But this was the first ever peacetime draft. Again, we were not in the war. So this is a peacetime draft, again, in preparation in case we needed to join the war. It's also during this time then that we have over 16 million soldiers, sailors, and aviators, known as GIs, or government issues. Another important stat that I want you to be aware of is on the very bottom. That last bullet point is the fact that over 350,000 women volunteered for the war. In a little bit, you're going to be watching a video clip about the important role that women played in World War II. So once we were in the war, and even a little bit before then, we talked about, mobilization, what we did to prepare. And one thing that we did to prepare for war was the shifting of our consumer production to war production instead, right? So on the video that you're going to watch, it's also going to talk about companies making Jeeps, right? Making vehicles for military purposes instead of just for people driving on the road. And so there was this huge shift, again, from consumer production to war production. It completely reduces our unemployment. Remember, we were in the midst of the Great Depression. World War II and consumer production shifting to war production is actually what helps us end the Great Depression. And people are going back to work and feeling good about being back at work, right? They're enthusiastic about it. They feel like it has a purpose to them. Between making Jeeps, like we mentioned, and airplanes and ships as well. The idea of Liberty ships. That was the other kind of fun thing, is everything had a nickname at the time. It wasn't just a ship, it was a Liberty ship, right? To help bring supplies to troops, to help the fight for liberty and freedoms around the world. Just one example of that shift in production that I want to give you is this one. In 1941, over 3 million cars were produced in the United States. All right, so 1941, 3 million cars were produced. Remember, we joined the war at the very end of 1941. If you combine the years of 42, 43, 44, and 45, only 139 cars were actually produced during that time. So we went from 3 million in 1 year to just 139 combined in a 4-year time frame, right? Because again, our industry wasn't producing cars for just the average American to drive. They were now producing war vehicles to be used in the fight in World War II. Another way that Americans could help unite to support the war effort was to ration the materials that we had here. So there were shortages of products that were used for war products. So like rubber and metal and nylon, for example, even fuel. And so people decided to do what they could to help support the war effort. And there were rations. And so with rations, it means there's a fair distribution of limited goods. So you're only allowed so much of certain products. And people were fine with that system, right? Because they felt like they were doing their part to help out the war. because of those rations, because of the shortages, other ways that people could help out were by planting their own gardens, right? Because they wanted the majority of the food that was produced by large scale farming to go to the troops. And so many people planted their own victory gardens, right? There's a nickname again. You have Liberty ships, you have victory gardens. The idea there is that if you would plant your own garden, you could help, replenish the food supply again those large scale farms and being able to ship those products to soldiers that need them and produce some of your own food at home. This would be that ideal time to watch the America, the Story of Us clip. That there's a link for it on Schoology, so you can watch it now. Or like I said, if you have Amazon Prime as well. But this would be a good time to look at that clip. It really just talks about the United States coming together, that shift again from consumer production to wartime production and how it was able to help us in World War II. Another thing happening on the home front during World War II was the use of propaganda. We're familiar with propaganda. Typically, it has more of a negative connotation to it. When you hear the word propaganda, it usually kind of brings up, feelings that someone's are trying to sway your opinion, but in a negative way. In particular, because we are probably most familiar with the propaganda that Hitler and the Nazi Party used in Germany during this time. But propaganda, just in general, is information that is spread for the purpose of promoting some cause. It was used by all sides in World War II. In the United States, for the most part, it was used to gain support for the war, and to really unite people, right, in our fight. With the different forms of propaganda, artists would use a variety of tools of propaganda to try to get their point across. So we're just going to look at some of the propaganda tools that we have listed here. These are on the bottom of your guided notes sheet, actually with the definitions, but I'm just going to go through them quickly for you. So demonization is portraying an enemy as evil, menacing, or murderous, maybe even aggressive. An emotional appeal is playing on people's emotions to promote the war effort. Name calling using loaded labels to encourage the hatred of the enemy. During World War II, you saw the term Jap being thrown around a lot. During the Cold War, it was the term commie. Another propaganda tool is patriotic appeal. Involves using patriotic language or symbols to appeal to people's national pride. Half truths or lies, deceptions, twisting of the truth, maybe lying by omission, so not telling the complete truth. The use of a catchy slogan, using a memorable phrase to foster support for the war, right? Something that people are going to remember. Evocative visual symbols are using symbols that might appeal to people's emotions. So, maybe a mother potentially, or a child, or uniforms, flags, for example. And then the last up there is humor or caricatures, really trying to grab the viewer's attention through the use of humor to promote the war effort. So just to kind of recap the use of propaganda, again, a huge part of it was to encourage Americans to support the war effort, right, to support military members. It really pushed people to do what they can on the home front. Like, sure, you might not be in the military, but what can you do as just an average citizen every day, with the rationing and helping to save resources, right? What can you do on your part to help support the war effort? And then a lot of propaganda talks about women being a secret weapon, and we'll actually see an example of that here coming up. A couple of terms I want you to be familiar with that you would see quite often on propaganda is the idea of bonds. This is money that's given to the government from individuals. If you buy a government bond, basically, it's like you're giving the government money, knowing that 5 years from now you'll get that money back with some interest. So it's a way to loan money to the government. And then also we've already kind of talked about rationing, the idea that you have a limited amount of some things that could be purchased by Americans during wartime, but that a lot of it was to be saved for our war efforts. The next few slides are just going to be some examples of propaganda from World War II using a variety of the propaganda tools. My hope is that you obviously will understand what propaganda means and also the tool that is used in it. And I believe there's actually a short answer question that will be asked about one of these. So this one here, this is the enemy, obviously using demonization, right? With this one, portraying the enemy as evil, murderous, and aggressive. It becomes even more powerful when the enemy is blamed for hurting maybe a female or a child or other non-combatants or just civilians. So here you can see the use of turning this Japanese person into a demonic character. This is a pretty famous piece of World War II propaganda. As you can see, they're using a catchy slogan of the idea of Jap trap. They're also using name calling by referring to Japanese people as a Jap on there. And the story behind this one, the main message of this one is the fact that material conservation, if we in the United States are able to conserve our materials, right, to ration things out, to do what we need to do our part, that's how we're going to defeat the Japanese, is by being responsible with our materials and conserving them. Another propaganda tool used in this one as well is humor caricatures by turning, this Japanese general into a mouse as well. This piece of propaganda, when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Okay, that's it. It's not necessarily a super catchy slogan, but that's kind of the idea here. They want you to join a car sharing club, right? We talked about rationing things like rubber. Okay, so think about what the tires are made of, or rationing fuel as well. And the idea that if you are driving by yourself, if you're not carpooling, you are maybe wasting those resources that could be used towards the war effort. This piece of propaganda uses a few tools. Emotional appeal, really trying to appeal to people's emotions on this one. Patriotic appeal. This looks like a Norman Rockwell painting, right? Here you have these three children. You've got the little boy in his newspaper hat with his American flag. Another one looks like he's holding an airplane. And it says, "Don't let that shadow touch them," by war bonds, right? And if you notice, of course, the shadow is of the swastika, or the Nazi symbol. The idea by buying war bonds, again, is to do your part to help out the government, to loan money to our government to help fight the war. So this one's definitely using emotional appeal and really trying to pull on your heartstrings. This would be an example of using evocative visual symbols, symbols that are trying to appeal to your emotions. So for example, here you have a soldier in uniform. Again, the message of this one is just to ration and do what you can in the country to support the war effort. This one here uses, emotional appeal, patriotic symbols, evocative visual symbols. There's a bunch of propaganda tools used in this one. Again, just kind of playing on the notion that you didn't want the people who died at Pearl Harbor, you don't want those deaths to be in vain, right? And so that we need to step up and do our part. If you look closely in the video clip from America, the Story of Us that I had you watch, you actually saw this poster hanging in the window at an employment office, right? Again, it's the idea of what can you do and what can you do to support the war effort and to be part of this mission that's bigger than ourselves. And part of that was drawing women into the workforce. With many men away at home, women stepped up and worked in the factories and shifted again that production to wartime industry where they were able to make a difference. This is just another example of the emotional appeal, right? You have a young child in there, you have a family that has planted their own garden. Again, as I mentioned this a bazillion times already, just doing whatever they can on their part to help support the war effort.